First, I want to welcome you to the NEDAS, first NEDAS webinar for 2016. We do have a terrific program today. Before I introduce our topic and presenter, I will do a little plug for the Northeast DAS and Small Cell Association. We are an in-building wireless association focused on enabling communications for folks that are in buildings or large arenas, leveraging technologies that amplify mobile signals. We do programs as well throughout the year. Our upcoming program is April 5th and 6th in New York City. It's our annual New York City In-Building Wireless Summit, followed by an event in Boston, a workshop and social on July 13th. We'll hold a Washington, D.C. Fall Summit on September 21st, and then we will head up to Toronto for some workshops and social on October 25th. We do have other webinars scheduled for this year. Our topics are currently underway, but if you wanted to mark your calendars, they will take place on March 22nd, June 21st, September 8th, and December 6th. So now back to today's scheduled programming. For this webinar, we will be taking questions via chat, so please type questions to me, the host, and we will put them in queue to address at the end of the presentation. Our topic today. On January 11th, New York State issued a $500 million solicitation for private sector partners to join the new New York broadband program, with a focus on unserved and underserved areas. The program calls for applications for funding to provide access to broadband at speeds of at least 100 megabits in most places and 25 megabits in the most remote areas. Today's webinar will provide interested applicants information and insights on how to use broadband services in New York communities. Today we are honored to have our esteemed colleague here, David Bronston, who is special counsel with the New York City firm of Phillips Lytle. He will be joined by his colleague, Bruce Frankowitz. David Bronston, who's, as I mentioned, is the special counsel with Phillips Lytle, focuses his practice on telecommunications infrastructure, on wireless, metro fiber, and data center issues. He's represented public and private property owners nationwide in license agreements, right-of-way agreements, and other access agreements with telecommunications service providers. He has also represented all types of telecommunications service providers and carriers in negotiating franchise agreements with local governments and obtaining all necessary legislative authorizations and administrative licenses, permits, and approvals for network deployment. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to David Bronston and his colleague, Bruce. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you, team, and thank you all for joining us. As Alyssa said, I'm David Bronston, and my telecommunications colleague and comrade in arms from our Rochester office, Bruce Frankwich, is on as well. He won't be able to. I won't be able to see him roll his eyes or kick me under the table, but we'll try to stay on track. What the plan is, we'll probably talk for about half an hour. I'll go through generally the background and the outline of the RFP, and then Bruce will go into some of the important points of the grant disbursement agreement that you would enter into if you win a grant, and some of the topics in the appendices to the RFP and the grant disbursement agreement that will highlight some of the important terms and conditions for you to be aware of. So, with that, the background to this is that on January 8th, the governor, as part of his agenda for 2016, has made broadband an important policy issue for him, and he had prongs to that proposal. The first was the Charter Time Warner transaction. The PSC gave the Service Commission gave the approval of the New York State Public Service Commission to the transaction, but they placed certain conditions on it. Of note to us, they required higher speed upgrades and services to 145,000 unserved areas. That's a separate issue. The conditional order is public. You can review it at the PSC website. What we're talking about is the other prong of this proposal, which is the New York Broadband Grant Program. It's funded with $500 million from bank settlements. It's more than any other state has dedicated to broadband, and it's viewed as a public-private partnership in that it'll be partly funded by these state grants and partly funded by the private sector. The goal is to have service of 100 megabits per second statewide by the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. And in addition, there have already been $70 million in REDC, Regional Economic Development Council, and Connect New York grants that have already are in place. And I'll turn to that. The schedule, January 2016 the solicitation was reviewed on, was released on January 11th. February 9th of this year, there was a forum in Liverpool, New York. Bruce attended that, of about 150 stakeholders. March 1st, 2016, the application portal opens to receive applications. On April 15, 2016, at the close of business, applications are due and the portal closes. In the meantime, the state has been hiring up consultants and reviewers to read applications with the goal of having awards made by the summer. So let's go through some of the eligibility requirements. Basically, any entity is eligible to apply. You see a list. You can be an incorporated organization, unincorporated, you know, LLCs, not-for-profit, public-private. There's one caveat, though, that as part of if you're going solo, you have to be a network operator with at least 500 customers. If you're part of a group, your group has to have at least a network operator with at least 500 customers. So when I say no startups, I mean you can have other startups as part of, you know, vendors or service providers or part of your team in any way, but you have to have an established network operator with at least 500 customers as part of your application team. As you've heard throughout, projects only address unserved or underserved areas. There's a minimum service area. You have to provide service to at least a minimum of 2,500 units. And units is a broad, it's not just homes, it can be libraries and educational centers, et cetera. But it has to be within the whole census block. You can't break up a census block. And it has to, again, be an eligible census block. And you can find those eligible census blocks on the website in a mapping application. You have to, if you are serving underserved areas, you have to submit one application. If you're serving unserved areas, you have to submit a separate application. There are 3 territories that are basically excluded from this phase 1 that cover areas of unserved or underserved. The first is, as we discussed, the 145,000 unpassed Time Warner Cable franchise homes within the Time Warner franchise areas that are covered now by the PSC order. There's areas under the Connect America Fund service territory, which are a variety.
I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And then finally, there are areas covered by the $70 million in qualifying Connect New York and Regional Economic Development Council projects previously awarded. In B, this is essentially your capital stack. The state will provide 50% of the project costs, but they would prefer, obviously, if they could do a 20% minimum. you have to have 10% of your eligible project costs have to be covered by an equity investment, skin in the game, if you would. You must demonstrate that cash or commitments for the applicant's portion. So if you want the state to put up 50, you put up 10%, that leaves you 40% that can be that you have to raise either through bank debt, you can put in more equity, if you can get other grants, but you have to make up that portion with essentially cash or commitments for the applicant's portion. So even if you don't have the commitment in place by the April deadline, you have to be able to show that you're pretty close to having a fully funded application project. The speed goals are critical, obviously. The proposed technologies must meet the governor's goals as well. And according to FB, fiber and cable are pre-approved because we know they can meet the speed goals, and so they are favored. DSL and fixed wireless have a higher threshold and must prove that the speed goals can be met with that technology. So sort of a heavier lift for that technology. Projects, here's the big, buried the lead. Projects must be implemented, essentially completed by December 31st, 2018, and you have to show specific benchmarks along the way. One other important requirement is while you have, there's no rate regulation, if you would, there has to be at least a 5-year in place, a service at $60 a month for a 25 or higher megabits per second download, 4 megabits per second upload service tier. That $60 can escalate, with CPI over the time, but this is meant to address the affordability issue of internet use. That it's not just the access to the broadband, but there is an affordability issue. Also, the no data cap on this broadband tier. The applicants must demonstrate suitable fiscal standing and management capabilities. As we said, there has to be a network, an experienced network operator in there. You have to show the cash is on hand. You'll need to show 2 years of tax returns and 3 years of audited financials. Again, another big issue here, you have to make a commitment to complete the project, and the mechanism that Empire State Development has come up to show that is a $100,000 non-refundable deposit. It's refundable, obviously, if you don't win or get a grant, but you forfeit it if you win and you don't go forward, you don't finish, you don't enter into the grant disbursement agreement. Waivers are, of any of these requirements that we've gone through, can be sought from Empire State Development, but they're given solely in Empire State Development's discretion. The reverse auction process, the way that state is essentially grading these is that the lowest state subsidy per unit wins. And you can increase the units by serving libraries or education centers. They get bonus points, essentially 5 units each as a multiplier. So the more units you cover, that lowers the state per unit amount. It increases the denominator, if you would. So projects requiring the lowest state investment on a dollars per unit served basis will be will get the grant. Here's some, the legal issues, and we'll turn to the grant disbursement agreement shortly. Obviously, the state does not want you colluding, any applicants colluding among themselves to game the system and get state not as good a deal. Non-discrimination obviously speaks for itself. You have to show compliance with laws and good standing with New York State contracts. If you are a vendor or a service provider to a New York State agency, make sure you are in compliance, not in default. The next one is an interesting issue. It's sort of not, you won't find it within the RFP, but there are obviously going to be infrastructure deployment issues to be faced. That's permitting, pole attachment, potentially pole replacements, right-of-way agreements. You know, it's estimated that for, you know, you may need 5 to 7% pole replacement with the importance of the make-ready work. So you should be thinking of leveraging whatever existing assets, existing agreements for fiber, conduit, poles, towers, colo facilities. And then the upside is you can then leverage these New York broadband assets for other market opportunities, so long as you're providing the service you said you would in the application. There are, yes?
If I may, just to dovetail with your point on infrastructure deployment issues, you know, to the extent you can, it's certainly beneficial if when you design your network, you can include servicing perhaps cell towers for backhaul purposes, or perhaps even small cell deployments in certain metro areas. You know, obviously you'll have to take into account, you know, how close together you place your access points. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's great to have the capital to build these networks, but at the end of the day, you need to have a sustainable network that will, you know, pay for its operating costs on a go-forward basis. So to the extent you can design in connectivity to data centers and colo facilities and backhaul, you know, it just strengthens the longevity and the financial stability of your network going forward.
Right. Great. Thanks, Bruce. And there are minority women-owned business enterprise goals of 30% participation, disabled veterans goals of 6% participation, and you must show good faith efforts to achieve these goals over the course of the project. SEEKR is the State Environmental Quality Review requirements, and ESD will make the determination what level of SEEKR review is required for each winning application. G is an interesting issue which covers the state says that they want to have the ability to place an unsubordinated security interest on the assets that are funded by the state grants. That's going to be tricky if you have bank debt who's going to want a blanket lien on all these assets, and it's going to be very hard to determine which assets are funded specifically by the state and how you can segregate them for a separate unsubordinated security interest. But that hasn't been determined yet. But by agreeing to this, you agree that you would be willing to obtain that. Environmental sustainability, they want you to use recyclable materials to the greatest extent. Sharing of tax information, Department of Finance will share your tax information with Empire State Development. Department of Labor will share your labor information filed with Empire State Development. The 100,000, oops, I'm sorry, I missed my cue. The $100,000 deposit is, as we said, refundable if you don't win. It's due with the application. It can be enough. We think they haven't determined. We're waiting for greater clarity and guidance from Empire State Development on this, but it's probably going to be an LC or cash, and many companies, an LC is going to have cash or other collateral behind it. FOIL confidentiality. In your application, if you have sections or figures or things that you consider proprietary, confidential, or trade secret that are not otherwise public and that you feel would cause competitive harm to your business, if they were made public, you should identify those in the application clearly. You should not make your entire application subject to confidentiality, but only the sections where you can demonstrate that there's a likelihood or a possibility of disclosure causing competitive harm. So with that, I'll let Bruce back clean up and go through some of the other T's and C's should you be fortunate enough to win.
Thanks, David. So with regard to as we all know, the purpose of the grant proceeds are to facilitate the deployment of broadband facilities and make them available to unserved, underserved areas. To do that, there are eligible costs and ineligible costs. So costs that are eligible for reimbursement with grant funds are basically meant to be the CapEx costs for deploying the network. Generally speaking, it's not meant to cover operating expenses. Examples of eligible capital expenses include, your fiber, your conduit, reasonable make-ready costs, Ethernet switches, things of that nature. The building drops or laterals are subject to reimbursement if it's considered of standard length, which is 150 feet long. If the lateral is longer than 150 feet, I think it then falls into the category of special construction, and that's to be paid for by the consumer. So if you've got a lateral longer than 150 feet, or if you have to set a pole on a customer's property to bring service to them, that would be considered special construction. Other eligible costs include a component for indirect expenses, indirect costs, such as maintenance and operating expenses, but these are capped. They're capped at 15% of the applicant's eligible expenses.
And Bruce said those can include soft costs, in preparing the application, et cetera.
Yes, they can. Yes, they can. They can include exactly those costs. What they can include, though, is operating expenses the applicant incurs prior to the date of the grant awarding or the announcement of the grant being awarded to you. So there's going to be a fine line there. Along with the grant, funds are going to be dispersed quarterly, at least no more frequently than quarterly, but there's going to be ongoing compliance reporting requirements and mapping that need to be satisfied as a prerequisite to funds being made available and dispersed. Quite frankly, the Empire State Development wants to be able to demonstrate that the funds, were used for their intended purpose, and areas that were previously unserved or underserved are now served. So mapping the results of your network deployment is part of that quarterly reporting. For those of you with an exit on your horizon, there is a clawback provision in the grant where if the network is sold, for instance, within the first year after the disbursements are made, the Empire State Development can recoup 100% of the dispersed grant amount. And in year 2, they can recover 80%, year 3, 60%, year 4, 40%, and in the 5th year, 20%. So, be aware of that in your planning as well. Similarly, there is a mechanism by which Empire State Development can recoup or recapture a portion of the awarded grant if you fail to meet the milestones that you lay out for construction in your project plan. For greater detail on those, you can take a look at Exhibit E of the Grant Disbursement Agreement. You know, as with many type of construction agreements and contracts, you do have to maintain books and records to memorialize the construction of the network. That has to be maintained throughout the term of the grant agreement and for 3 years after termination or expiration. Empire State Development can audit those books and records, you know, upon reasonable notice. Insurance. Basically, the network has to be insured for replacement costs, and you also need to maintain a CGL, Commercial General Liability Policy. For areas outside of New York, Long Island, and Westchester County, basically you need to have, for the CGL policy, $1 million in coverage per occurrence, $2 million in the aggregate, and an umbrella of $3 million. There's also a requirement for applicants to exert good faith marketing efforts. Again, the point is to make the networks available and have them utilized by the citizens of the state. So in order to increase your adoption rates and your subscribers, you may need to provide to Empire State Development copies of all your marketing plans and your marketing materials, copies of any advertisements that you use, identify specific reasons if you're having low adoption rates, as well as a contingency plan to address those adoption rates. You know, lessons from the BTOP grant program were that, you know, when people made their forecasts and projections for how quickly they thought they would be able to sign up subscribers for the networks, you know, surprise, surprise, it generally took longer than people expected. So, you know, and one of the keys to getting a jump start on pushing your subscribers is the minute the award is announced, you know, coordinate and get the press out there, maintain a website with social media that shows the development of your project over time. But it also is very beneficial to have a local champion that, you know, touts, you know, either a local politician or some citizen or advocate that can, you know, tout the virtues of the network and the services that you're bringing to people in the area. Legal opinion, if the grant award is in excess of $100,000, one of the conditions to getting the funds dispersed to you is that you have to provide Empire State Development with a legal opinion as to the applicant's due formation and, in essence, being in good standing.
I think that's great. I think that wraps up our presentation. This is the link. This link is to the RFP. The New York Broadband program is, as you know, managed by the Empire State Development and their Broadband Program Office. They're very interested in getting the word out. They want this to be successful. We had hoped to have them participate, but logistical issues arose. I will give you the email address of the Director of Outreach, and she welcomes any and all questions. And again, we're interpreting what we've read and looked at and spoken to them to some degree, but any definitive answers or interpretations have to come from ESD. And her name is Anna Rua, and it's ANA.RUA, Anna Rua, Anna.Rua at ESD.NY.gov. That's Anna.Rua at esd.ny.gov. At their website, you'll also find several presentations from the Liverpool Forum, Stakeholders Forum, including one that drills down into the mapping applications. So with that, I think we got just in under the half hour, and we're happy to take questions to the best of our abilities.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, David and Bruce. That was really well done. Went through a lot of details and insights that I'm sure will help loads of people. We are taking questions. The way that we're taking questions so that we don't talk over one another is through the chat window. The chat window is typically on your right-hand side, and if you type them and send them to me, the host, I'll be able to read them off and have David and or Bruce respond to them. So we are taking questions at this time. Is there an expectation at all, David or Bruce, as to how many companies will be applying for this program?
A good question. I don't know the answer. I think, there's so many layers and moving parts to this to know ultimately who will. But this is called phase 1, so it's not like there won't be other phases if you don't go into this one necessarily.
Is there a guarantee that they're going to pick providers through this process, or is it not guaranteed that they will proceed at this point?
They'll only proceed if they get eligible applications.
Got it. Okay.
Which I expect they will.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned something about collusion. How did they, from their perspective, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but how do they differentiate a partnership or collaboration from collusion in these submissions?
Also a good question. I think it's, what's the motivation? I mean, obviously, they welcome participations and partnerships, but if the intention is to really lowball, lowball in a reverse auction, I don't know what lowballing in a reverse auction is, but if you're, trying to, manage the bid so that the state is harmed, that, with another party, that would be collusion. Got it. Okay.
I mean, I think there's going to be, there would be some dialogue permitted amongst, applicants that are part of one application. It's if multiple applicants coordinate their bids, I think is what the state would violate the anti-collusion provision.
Absolutely, absolutely. Do we have any questions from our participants? Like I said, if you do have any questions, please use your chat window. I do have a question that came in. Can you please explain any spectrum issues if you're applying to provide broadband via LTE with varying backhaul options?
Bruce, I'll take a crack at it and then you can chime in. I don't think there are spectrum issues. If you have the spectrum, that's, great. But as I did allude to, a wireless technology is not a pre-approved or favored technology for the last mile connection to the end user, if you would. So you're going to have to be able to show that you can deliver the speeds that are the goals of this program by that wireless technology.
Right, and related to that, you have to submit it. If you're using multiple technologies to service your service area, you need to have one application per technology. So, that's another wrinkle to be aware of. But the definition of fixed wireless in the appendix to the grant to the RFI, is pretty generic. But yeah, you would have to demonstrate that those speeds can meet the speed requirements set forth in the RFI.
Got it. It's very helpful. Thank you. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I think that's about it. We'll call it a wrap. Really do appreciate, David, your time today, the insights, the information. What is the due date again for the applications for this?
The portal opens March 1st. The portal closes April 15th, tax day. So you can decide what check you want to write.
You know,
Exactly.
it does close at 4:30 p.m. So you don't want to wait till the last minute, because the online portal could become bogged down, and if you miss the filing deadline, they won't review your application. So
yeah, they're pretty strict about that. And then I guess if anybody has any questions or may want some insights or even a review of the materials, how can they contact you guys?
If you go to the Phillips Lytle website, you'll find all our information and contact information, and happy to talk to anyone about this. If we can provide any help, guidance, whatever, and certainly, help with rights-of-way agreements or other issues that may come up, feel free to give us a ring or ping us on our emails.
Great. Excellent. So March 1, the portal opens. April 15th at 4:30 it closes. Don't be late because you won't be considered. Now's the time to start, preparing your materials and looking to see what you might be able to submit. Any questions, you can go to the Phillips Lytle website and find David and/or Bruce, and they'd be more than happy to help. The link here is www.nysbroadband.ny.gov/node/376. And
that's for the RFP. That's for the RFP. Yeah. That's for the
RFP, of course. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and we do hope to see you at the Northeast DAS National Association Spring event on April 6th in New York. Thank you.
Thanks, Alyssa.